we've been working through a series in the Gospel of John, and if you have your Bibles with you, or you can use the one in front, please turn to chapter 8. And if you haven't been here for a while, or this is your first time, we are going through the Gospel of John. We're going verse through verse, like we're kind of just going straight through the book, looking at all the stories, and particularly we're honing in on this idea of new life, and that Jesus is the source of life for us and for the world and for the church. And over the last several weeks, we have worked our way through chapters 7 and 8. And this is where Jesus has gone up to the Feast of the Tabernacles, which was a major festival for the Jewish people, where they recognized how God provided for them in the wilderness. And this time of Lent is also a time where we remember of Jesus's own time in the wilderness, and how God provides for us and provides life in the most desperate situations. And Jesus goes to this festival, and he does something very different, where they used to remember the way God does things. Jesus was controversial in this aspect, where he pointed to himself, that he was unique, that he came from God, and that he was the true source of light in the world and water and life. Just that he was replacing this ceremony. That all of that pointed to Jesus and what he was going to do on the cross. And he was rooting, our life and our freedom is really found in him and his teachings. And this is really controversial, and people hated Jesus for it. And mainly it was the religious elite, but also others became increasingly angry because they thought, Jesus is a blasphemer. How can this person who we know, claim to be God, claim to have this intimacy with God? And we see kind of a similar pattern emerge through the stories from the rest of the gospel, and we'll see them continue. But Jesus preaches, and people become more and more agitated and misunderstand what Jesus says. And last week we looked at people who, at first believed in Jesus, that they believed that he was the light of the world and that he was Messiah. But on some level, they didn't completely agree. And that they too had disagreed with what Jesus was teaching and grown to become agitated at Jesus, to the point where we'll see they think he's crazy. And we're going to see kind of how the story ends. And last week we talked about the importance of believing everything that Jesus teaches, even if it's difficult for us. And so this is where we pick up on verse 48. The Jews answered him, "Aren't we right in saying that you are a Samaritan and demon-possessed?" "I am not possessed by a demon," said Jesus, "but I honor my Father whom you dishonor and dishonor me. I am not seeking glory for myself, but there is one who seeks it, and he is judge. Very truly I tell you, whoever obeys my word will never see death." Or in other translations, it says "keep my word." And I found this is an NIV that isn't the same as the Pewbacks, but it must have been updated, so it's a little different there. But and at this they exclaimed, "Now we know that you're demon-possessed. Abraham died, and so did the prophets. Yet you say that whoever obeys your word will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham? He had died, and so did the prophets. Who do you think you are?" Jesus replied, "If I glorify myself, my glory means nothing. My Father, whom you claim as your God, is the one who glorifies me, though you do not know him. I know him. If I said I did not, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him, and I obey his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced at the thought of seeing my day, and he saw it and was glad. You are not yet 50 years old, they said to him, and you have seen Abraham. Truly I tell you, Jesus answered, before Abraham was, I am. And at this they picked up stones, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. So we see, there's these people who at once believed, and then Jesus makes some astonishing claims of who he is and what he has, and they think he's crazy. To the point where at the beginning of this, Jesus was like, you're wanting to kill me, and they're like, no, we're not. And then at the end, they end up, trying to pick up stones to kill him because he makes this claim, before Abraham was, I am. But Jesus slips away. I was recently watched a TED Talk on YouTube, and if you're unfamiliar with what a TED Talk is, there are these brief videos from like 5 to 20 minutes that are often billed as the most innovative, cutting-edge ideas in the world. And the organizers of these presentations bill them as ideas worth spreading. And I recently listened to one entitled, Why There Is No Way Back for Religion in the West. And it was done by a quantitative social scientist named David Voss. And I don't even know what that means, really, a quantitative social scientist, but he looked at the patterns and demography of religion in places like Western Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, and noticed that there has been a sharp decline in religiosity. But he was claiming that it was dying, and it wasn't going to change, and inevitably would go to be extinct or be such an insignificant minority that it would be virtually extinct. And these were as the effects of things like modernism and secularism that has been growing, and he sees as being predictable and permanent. And during his talk, he highlighted some really compelling data that showed decline of religious commitments in Western industrial nations. And a lot of this information isn't new. And he just kind of correlated them. And other researchers like Pew and Barna also point to the same thing. But what I thought was so interesting about his presentation, and I had kind of an observation, a question, and my first observation was, despite all of his data, you have to have a faith commitment to it, because most of his conclusions seem rather extreme and absolute, and there was no really way to prove his point because he doesn't know the future. You can see a trend line, but he can't foresee that goes forever. And my next question was, why was this an idea we're spreading in the first place? And I think it lied in the way that his demonstration kind of was rooted in this sense of purely of a matter-of-fact way. And it had a coolness of neutrality that had a kind of a subtext to itself. And as well as a few subtle jokes at the beginning that made it seem that, when he was going to talk about religion, they were like, he made a joke being like, oh, don't head for the doors, like religion was a bad thing to talk about in the first place. And so clearly it seemed like his audience was keyed into this idea that, religion might be a bad thing. Religious commitments might be a bad thing. Faith might be a bad thing. But he encouraged them to stay because he was sharing that, don't worry, religion's going away. And he thought that this was a good thing. And I think that, and it was, and depending on your perspective, this is a good thing or a bad thing. But I think both people, depending on what perspective you share, religion is, declining. And for some, that's a good thing. And for some, because they think it's a good thing because they associate, religion with things like stifling rules or abuse or extremism. There's lots of headlines of how religious communities fail, or religious belief is too extreme and leads to things like violence, or we all know stories of sexual abuse at the hands of religious people. And these are truly negative things. But it glosses over all the good things, right? And whatever you believe, I think we can all agree that church is in decline. And it's easy to feel this way, because whether you measure belonging or believing or participation in religious services, the church has been hemorrhaging people for decades. And it's been kind of a problem for so long that I was reading, old minutes back in the yearly meeting. This was they talked about this in 1996. So this hasn't been a new thing. Though I think many of us who are gathered here this Sunday would be fretting this. This isn't a good thing. But I don't believe that this decline is an end altogether. And I don't believe David Voss's assessment that this is a permanent and irrevocable change. That because in our tradition, in the Christian tradition, even in the face of decline and in the face of death, that Jesus teaches that resurrection is possible, revival is possible, new life is possible. And Jesus connects it to this idea, that it's connected to his teaching, connected to his way of being, connected to his word. And I think that there are some who, and I think many of us who are gathered here or who are concerned about this we're wondering what's the ticket? What do we do next? What's the path forward? Or are we just gonna kind of go away? And I would say that Jesus here is not saying that there is a silver bullet, that there isn't any new kind of teaching or program or technique, but it's simply to being faithful to what Jesus has already said. Jesus' central claim in the passage is that whoever believes or keeps his word or abides in his word will never see death. Well, we know on the surface that that's not completely true, in the sense that people who believe Jesus won't literally never die. That wasn't even true for Jesus. Jesus suffered and died, and yet he obeyed the Father. And then the rest of Christian history points to the fact that there have been plenty of wonderful Christian people who believed wholeheartedly in Jesus, and they still pass away. They still die. However, I don't think that Jesus was never saying, that you'd never experience death ever. But rather, he was pointing us forward to this idea of resurrection. What I think is interesting in this passage is that it kind of points back to Genesis, where God tells Adam and Eve, if you eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, then you will surely die. And they eat it, but they don't die right away. They live for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. But yet they were talking about a spiritual sort of death, which they eventually succumb to. But here, I think Jesus is saying he's kind of doing this in reverse. Those who eat of the knowledge of Jesus will live forever and will experience a spiritual life and a spiritual resurrection, and that death isn't the end. Jesus is looking forward towards the resurrection for those who believe in him. That there's a kind of life awaiting those who believe. And while I think there's a natural inclination to want to read this passage as an individual, and it's totally valid because Jesus is speaking on an individual level here, as it sounds. And I think that that's true, that those who believe in Jesus can experience new life after we die, that we'll experience the resurrection like Jesus. And I think that, and this is rooted in a tradition that we look forward to Jesus and what he did for us, and we model ourselves after that. In our cultural moment of religious decline, though, I believe that we can apply the same logic to the church and believe that resurrection is not only possible for individuals, but as, communities of individuals, as people gathered together. That as a community of people who believe in Jesus, we believe that we won't go extinct. And that we can experience revival. Just as much as an individual can experience new life, the church can experience new life. And that decline is never the end. In our era of secularism and deconstruction, doubt rather than faith is the default approach to belief. And I think it's really easy to then just question everything and to disregard Jesus' teachings as either naive or crazy, just like the Jews thought he was crazy. But unlike then, where they had this high view of God, where they wanted to kill Jesus to honor God, here we just have this growing indifference. That we want to just be like, oh yeah, those religious people, they're kind of nutty. And just to kind of just push them off into a corner and never mind them. And I think that people like David Voss would think that Jesus was probably a little bit out of his mind. And to make such a claim of never-ending life, and just like the Jews who didn't believe, who thought Jesus was also demon-possessed. And I think that there is a temptation for us in the church to want to disbelieve Jesus too, and move away from his teachings as a community and move to something else in face of steep decline and the fear of near death. That we want quick results. Eugene Peterson once said that there's a great market for religious experience in the world. However, that there's little enthusiasm for patient acquisition of virtue. Little are inclined to sign up for the long apprenticeship of what earlier generations of Christians called holiness. I think that the church fears that it can't endure a continued long apprenticeship of Christian holiness anymore. So we turn away from those things that have been held. We walk away from Jesus' teachings to maybe turn into, to seek a more memorable church experience, to gather those seeking a new kind of religious experience. And I've seen this in my life. We of churches that turn to, entrepreneurial techniques or charismatic leaders or appeals to cultural forms to make the church appear more relevant and cool as a means for salvation from extinction. However, I believe and I'm convinced that the future of the church and the future for all of us isn't, some cool new program or a gifted leader or relevant programming or just, flashy things, but a radical commitment to the way of Jesus. A radical discipleship to Jesus. Because I think more and more people are less interested in religious experience. And I think that more and more people want something authentic. I know over the last couple decades, I've witnessed approaches of people who craft, stellar religious experiences. But after a while, they fall flat and become empty. And sooner or later, people see the cracks. And I'm reminded of this especially as I've seen the headlines of big popular megachurches, fall because their leaders are more concerned about outward appearances and than attending to their own character. And thus they face scandals down the road that end up doing more harm than good, and creates people to have more skepticism. And I think even Jesus warns us of this approach in Matthew 23, where he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, for you are like whitewashed tombs, which are outwardly beautiful, but within are full of dead people's bones." That many people who want to create a religious experience, but they're dead inside. People who claim to represent God, who are more focused on the outward things rather than seeking the inward transformation of our Lord. So then they tend to be no better than the world. And so whatever reasons that people, belong to a church, after those things go away, like, what's the point? And I know for me, like after people see these scandals go over and over, people find it just more enjoyable to just sleep in on a Sunday or go to brunch and eat delicious biscuits and gravy and have a mimosa for their communion rather than coming to a church on a Sunday. Because it's like, I remember when the pandemic happened, truth be told, I was like, oh, and we all shut down. It was kind of nice being like, oh, I can sleep in and I don't have to put on nice clothes and go to church. But the problem is that over time, brunch, biscuits and gravy and mimosas doesn't cut it anymore. Because things with secularism, things where it's just you're just following your appetites to do whatever it makes you feel good, it doesn't give you any purpose or meaning. And it doesn't create avenues to create characters, to create character and virtue in our lives. It doesn't give us a sense of peace when the world is full of anxiety. And it doesn't give us hope when we are in despair. And it just boils life down to seeking pleasure and happiness. But if you try to seek those things, you'll never find them. And I believe that David, despite David Voss's assessment, I think that in a matter of time, more people will realize that there's more to life than simply what secularism has to offer. There's more to life than brunch on Sunday. And that they'll start to search again for God, and searching for an alternative, searching for the life that God gives, that transforms, and this alternative way of being, the way of Jesus. I think we need to model that as a community, so that when people are ready to find it, they'll see it. They'll see people committed to the way of Jesus, embodying that patient pilgrimage of holiness, even in the face of death. For it speaks to something deeper and something more profound, and is the life that I think people want. And I know that this isn't true in my life. And I've seen this both as an individual and I've had my moments where I've doubted. I remember before I was a Christian, I was in a low point, and I had despair. And I didn't grow up particularly religious. I grew up, I went to Sunday school because when I'd ever go to my grandma's church, I'd go with her, and she was super faithful, and so, I heard about the Jesus story, kind of. I heard about the birth of Jesus, and I heard some Bible stories, but it wasn't like a part of my life, right? And by the time I got into high school, things were really rough for me. in all honesty. And I was struggling with trying to understand, like, is there more to life? You know, is this all that there is? Do I have meaning? And I was suffocating under that because at that point, I just didn't see it. I didn't see that I had any meaning. I was just like one other person. I felt like I was just dust. I felt like I was a burden to my family that was a wreck. And I didn't know what to do. But then I found people who were different, who genuinely cared and believed that there was more to life and that there's purpose in this life. And I had in my own encounter with Jesus where I realized that there's more to life, and that God has a plan for each and every one of us. And then again, later when I was, as an adult, I was gripped with just, what do we do? I saw so many scandals, and I was questioning my faith, and I just didn't know where I belonged and felt spiritually homeless. And I was searching for a community. And every time I felt like whatever church I was that I came to, I saw that there was people who really embodied what Jesus taught and believed. And that grounded me in a way. I saw people who were committed to Jesus' teaching in Matthew 25 of helping the stranger and to working to furnish refugees having a home. I saw it of churches who opened their doors to help the homeless. I saw it in my life as people came around me to give me a home when I felt like I didn't have one. And there was a steadiness to them that I needed. And I think that there's a steadiness that the church needs to provide this world. So I guess the question then is, what does this look like for us here at South Salem? What does it look like to be an apprentice of Jesus? To commit to this, even in the face of decline, in a world where religion seems irrelevant. And I think that it's three things. It's to be with Jesus, to start to do the things that Jesus did, and to become more like Jesus ourselves. So first, I think it's spending time with Jesus. That any kind of relationship only works when you spend time with the person, even in the good times and the bad times. And I think that, and for us, that's prayer, and that we need to be a people of prayer and people who seek after God desperately in prayer, both as individuals and as a corporate body in worship. We need to carve out the space and prioritize spending time with Jesus. And because Jesus was first and foremost a person of prayer too, he constantly modeled slipping away to spending time with his Father, to listen to his Father, to listen to discern what the Father's will was, so that we could do it. And I believe that if we're gonna be a people that want to be dedicated to knowing who Jesus is, it takes time to spend time with him, and spending time to read the Word and to pray over it. And I think second, the next thing is that we need to become like Jesus in our character. We need to learn what kind of character that Jesus had and develop that same character in our lives. And as a church, we need to study diligently the life of Christ to see what kind of person he was, and then live it out. Engage in the hard work of what Paul the apostle has called us to, putting off the old self and putting on the new self. And I know I've seen people in my life who've done this, and it speaks to something life transformative. And I'm sure that you can think of people who have had this character of Jesus in their lives and see how transformative it was, and that they touched your life in a way that they won't be forgotten. And I believe that that's Jesus working through that person and making their life be more than just their own. And simply put, I believe that putting on this putting on Christ is to developing the fruits of the Spirit of love, of peace, of patience, of kindness, of goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. I think that these are things that we all crave, and when we see these in people, it speaks to a testament to them and their relationship with God. And third thing, that we need to do the things that Jesus did. Jesus shone throughout the gospel of doing lots of different kinds of things. And I'm sure that there are things that we can point to that we're like, oh, I can't do that, like, miracles, right? Like I can't, multiply bread. But there's lots of things that we can do. We can take time for solitude and silence and prayer. We can have rhythms of contemplation and of action. We can serve the poor. We can speak out against injustice and evil. We can righteously suffer at the hands of our enemies to show them that they're loved. We can teach others about the kingdom. We can proclaim the gospels to people, and we can have compassion and to weep with those who are weeping. We can sit with those who are having difficulty and share in their pain. And to practice the way of Jesus doesn't just occur on a Sunday. It actually is a whole life commitment. It's a lifestyle requiring a whole life dedication to the way of Jesus so that it permeates every square inch of our lives. And as we do this as individuals, it will seep into our community. As Christians, each year we're reminded during Easter that we believe in the resurrection, and as Jesus was obedient to the Father, even unto death, that we are saved. And it pleased the Father that to raise Jesus from the grave. And that death really isn't the end. It's just a beginning of a new creation and a new way of being. And so why would it be so hard for us to believe that Jesus wouldn't do this, not only for us, but for the church? Especially when Jesus said to Peter that the gates of hell would not prevail over his church. So let us aim then, especially in a world that's indifferent to God at the moment, to show them that what a difference it does make to experience the power of the resurrection. Jesus, you are so good. And we recognize that you are grieved by death, and that you came to rescue us. You came to rescue us from death and to give us life. And that the way to do that is to follow you and to obey your words. For you know that you call yourself the way, and you experience this yourself, that you walked through pain and suffering and sin so that you could liberate us from death. And we rest in your promise as a God of resurrection to resurrect us, to create revival, both in our spirits and as a church community. And I pray that we would dedicate our lives to you, Lord, that we can become like you, and that we can remember how we've seen you work time and time again and have been faithful to raise us up when we are low. And Holy Spirit, I pray that you would give us this power, give us this the strength to endure the long, patient walk of walking with you, even when it's difficult. And in Jesus' name, amen. Go in peace.